I want to state up front that this video is going to deal with some very heavy topics, all of which are woven into the fabric of Half-Life 2's core narrative. There will at some points in this video be some non-graphic images and discussion of genocide, the Holocaust, and war crimes committed by US military in the Iraq War, including torture. This video would not be possible without viewer support over at my Patreon. I intend to make many more videos like this that cover film, video games, music, and other pieces of pop culture from the 20th and 21st centuries. Patrons got access to over an hour and a half of this video early, and if you'd like to see videos like this early or support the creation of future videos, please consider joining my Patreon. Any support is appreciated, and I hope you enjoy.
Rather than try to answer every possible question unvoiced. First, let us consider the fact that for the first time ever, as a species, immortality is in our reach.
The late 90s was an era marked by a certain cultural paranoia. This paranoia was most pronounced with the Y2K panic, but the Y2K panic pointed to a broader issue. In an increasing era of technological innovation and increased reliance on digital technology for our economic, political, and cultural infrastructures, the impact of said technological advancement on our lives was borderline incomprehensible. A large amount of the advancements in culture and technology in the late 20th century in America were in response to the Cold War. The neoliberal policies which started to take hold in the early 1980s, in part, were meant to win a culture war against communism through the supposed freedom of choice that a deregulated mass consumer market would allow. But after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, the massive power that corporations and the government had in weapons, surveillance, the economy, and media over common people would be easier to begin to question. Do we need the most advanced military in the world? Do politicians exist to serve us, or do they serve only their own interests? These were questions brought to the forefront of popular culture in the late 90s via the success of a number of works, most notably Fight Club and The Matrix. But video games explored similar themes around the same time in franchises like Metal Gear Solid, Deus Ex, System Shock, and in the original Half-Life. Half-Life at times closely resembled the techno-paranoia of The Matrix, reflecting similar anxieties about the role of the government, military, and modern technology in a post-Cold War environment. In fact, one could easily see Half-Life as both a metaphor for Cold War tensions and a predictor of the next war, the War on Terror. Half-Life has, at its core, a theme of skepticism, to not trust what you see. The game opens with the player positioned in the role of Gordon Freeman. While his role prior to the start of the game seems insignificant, by the end of the game, it becomes apparent that Gordon is a truly heroic figure. Gordon is meant to be a power fantasy for the sort of computer nerd of the late 90s who would most likely have played the game at the time. A white, cis man who either works in STEM or has fondness for the culture surrounding STEM work. As a nerd character who then becomes an action hero badass, Half-Life manages to be somewhat derivative of Die Hard, but replaces a working-class cop with an upper-middle-class theoretical physicist. Half-Life continually offers the player chances to express skepticism around what they see. The early prominence of a mysterious man in a suit, nicknamed the G-Man, suggests that the government might be aware of the goings-on at Black Mesa Research Facility, creating the impression that it's possible that the government either wanted the resonance cascade to happen, or expected it and allowed it to happen anyway. As the player enters into Black Mesa via a tram ride in the very opening of the game, they begin to see a number of features of the facility that might be cause for concern. Military helicopters, rockets that might alternatively be missiles, seemingly highly advanced technology including some sort of worker bot, etc. This is a great example of environmental storytelling, or more precisely, environmental tone setting. While we don't see these specific locales again, this opening scene foreshadows the dark truth underlying Black Mesa and, upon subsequent playthroughs, creates the sense of hostility to the player that on a first playthrough might not be so obvious. Half-Life's story starts in earnest when Gordon enters into the test chamber, a massive room that evokes feelings of both awe and fear. The test chamber is reminiscent to me of the computer room aboard the Nostromo in Alien. The computer room was meant to be womb-like, to create a sense of security amid an unending series of cold and indifferent corridors. But the test chamber, although womb-like in a similar sense, feels more like the belly of the beast, a moment where Black Mesa feels at its most hostile, most inhuman. Whatever impression the player gets, it's likely not felt as a warm welcome. A scientist earlier mentioned something about a resonance cascade scenario being unlikely, but at this point we have no concept of what resonance cascade might be referring to. We learn it the hard way when Gordon delivers the Zen crystal into the anti-mass spectrometer, or in layman's terms, puts the little shopping cart into the laser thingy. Somehow, something goes wrong, allowing aliens from a different dimension known as Zen to begin invading Black Mesa, causing chaos and disorder within the research facility, and in the process threatening the lives of scientists and potentially the planet at large. Early on in the game, there are opportunities for the player to express skepticism as to the motives or true nature of what they're seeing, but nothing big. That is, until the chapter We've Got Hostiles, when we first meet the Hazardous Environment Combat Unit, or HECU, a faction of the US Marines tasked with responding to the ongoing disaster at Black Mesa. We quickly learn that the HECU isn't here to save the scientists, but to kill them. It's a cover-up. This is the point where the game fully makes apparent that the military, and by extension the US government, are not on the side of the common people, but instead are fully pursuing their own interests at the expense of the lives of innocent civilians. About halfway through the game, Gordon is finally apprehended by HECU soldiers. Two soldiers carry a semi-conscious Gordon who overhears their breaking with protocol to bring him in for questioning, instead opting to leave Gordon in a trash compactor to kill him.
Where are we taking this Freeman guy? Topside for questioning. What the hell for? We got him. Let's kill him now. And if they find the body? Body? What body?
This blunt portrayal of US soldiers as sadistic and murderous is interesting. It conflicts with the trend beginning in the 21st century of portraying US soldiers in a broadly sympathetic light, particularly in video games. Then, the chapter that, to me, tells the whole story of Half-Life: questionable ethics. In this section of the game, we learn alongside Gordon that these aliens have been here for a while. We've had contact with them since long before the Resonance Cascade. We find them in cages, having strange and often cruel experiments conducted on them. While this does obviously have some direct analogs to animal experimentation in the real world, it's actually a lesser point compared to what we find out by the end of the chapter. The findings in Zen have been building towards developing advanced weaponry. We find the Gauss gun and the gluon gun, two weapons that seem to be highly advanced, using scientific research to create weapons that rely on some form of energy, as opposed to bullets. Energy weapons were, by this point in gaming history, somewhat common. But Half-Life uses environmental storytelling to suggest truths about the development of said weapons. Whatever Black Mesa Research Facility is up to, it's not purely for scientific purposes, but may also be for political, economic, or military purposes. This brings it all back to Cold War tensions. War has often been a motivator for technological advancement, and just as the atom bomb was developed by scientists for a supposed greater good of massive violence and military dominance, more advanced weaponry in the age of the Cold War was developed for similar purposes, creating an era of nuclear anxiety where the mass production of nuclear bombs and other forms of extreme violence hung over the heads of everyday people. Science was at the forefront of violence, or to quote System of a Down, "Science has failed our world." This is one of the broad themes of Half-Life, that as Gordon becomes a hero to fellow scientists, he becomes an ambiguous figure, existing on multiple axes. Even though he is almost a non-character, his role in the narrative of all of the Half-Life games calls into question the idea that his heroic status in Half-Life 1 is really as pure as it seems. After all, Gordon is partly responsible for the Resonance Cascade. He worked for the facility that was exploiting Zen and developing highly advanced technology. While he may have been kept in the dark as to the nature of what he was doing, that doesn't resolve the issue of the questionable ethics that Gordon participated in, both prior to the events of the original Half-Life and through the course of the game. And on that latter point, there's one major theme of Half-Life 1 that ultimately ends up being better expressed in its sequel: the ambiguous ethics of violence. While the game wants the player to commit violence, the game contextualizes this violence in certain ways. Zen is an ecosystem. Some of the creatures attacking, such as the headcrabs and hound eyes, are akin to animals, unaware of the consequences of what they do and lashing out purely on instinct. And then on the other end, there are the Vortigaunts, originally called alien slaves because they were enslaved by the Nihilanth. In essence, the Vortigaunts were drafted into a war they didn't want to fight, and thus, by killing the Vortigaunts, Gordon is killing innocent beings. This is not to say Gordon is sadistic or cruel. He's surviving same as they are. It's not up to either side to determine the outcome of this situation. Instead, it's the powers that be. Gordon was not clued into the nature of Black Mesa's goings-on, and he had to do what he had to do to survive. Meanwhile, the Vortigaunts, being enslaved, had no choice but to fight or die. This reflects on a common truth about war, which is that war is fought with the lives of often innocent, naive, or unwilling participants for the sake of those in power. These common people are then brutalized by war and forced to turn on other humans who, if not for the powers above them forcing the conflict, would actually have a lot more in common than the political differences that force them against one another. War dehumanizes the enemy systematically so that their destruction becomes justified. And often, this othering is portrayed in propaganda by portraying the threat of the other as animal-like or even alien. And in the case of science fiction, there is a long history of exploring Cold War anxieties by portraying the other as an invading alien force. Alien invasions were a somewhat common trope in the fiction of the 1950s and onward, as well as horror stories about experiments gone wrong. And while these story frameworks existed prior to the Cold War, their exploration during the Cold War created obvious metaphors for the Red Scare and other anxieties about ongoing threats of military conflict and the potential for nuclear annihilation. Half-Life 1 is a very B-movie influenced game. It takes Cold War-era science fiction tropes that by the 90s were considered camp, and injects them with a serious and much more 90s contemporary tone, reflecting on the role of capitalism and the US military and government as forces of moral ambiguity at best. And by humanizing the literal aliens that Gordon is forced to kill in Half-Life, it undermines Red Scare propaganda by suggesting that it's our own side that we should be afraid of. Now, I've made a whole video about Half-Life 1 in the past. It's one of my favorite games of all time, and I could easily go on about the first game at length. But if you click this video, you're likely here to talk about Half-Life 2. So let's talk about Half-Life 2. The years between Half-Life 1 and 2 were short by some standards, but quite long by the standards of video game sequels. Sequels are typically rushed to market within a year or two. Half-Life instead had a 6-year gap between the first and second game. It's hard to describe how drastically domestic and world affairs had changed in that time, except to say that by 2004 it was a different world. The first event of note is that the year 2000 came. The Y2K panic was a crisis averted, and it seemed like we were finally going to live the dream of peace that was initially promised by the end of the Cold War. But of course, that didn't happen. Instead, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 left the nation in shock. Americans became afraid for their future and leaned further into the comfort of an increasingly neoliberal, increasingly right-wing, and increasingly militaristic government under George W. Bush. The purported threat to American lives once again came from outsiders. Only this time, rather than a specific nation or even a specific ideology of threat, it was instead a specific manner of violence: terrorism. The war on terror was less a war and more a series of related military conflicts that revolved around America's very uneasy relationship to the Middle East. It centered primarily on wars waged in Afghanistan and Iraq, and its proclaimed purposes were capturing Osama bin Laden, bringing down the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, and introducing democracy into the Middle East. Whether this is what America really did or was really after is a separate topic altogether. What matters to this video isn't America's motives, but the propaganda campaign that ensued to ensure that the American populace would rally behind the government and US military against the vague threat of an outside terror. By being so vague in its aims and targets, the war on terror allowed the US a great degree of freedom to pursue whatever political, economic, or cultural projects in the Middle East they may have had in mind. 9/11 was one of two primary events that changed the tide of video game culture in the early 21st century, particularly when it comes to violent and political content in games. The other event was the Columbine High School massacre in April of 1999. The mass shooting at Columbine brought a renewed anxiety among parents and the more conservative populace in America, revolving around violent content in video games, due in part to the fact that the Columbine shooters were self-proclaimed fans of violent video games, most especially Doom. And while Doom and the later Grand Theft Auto franchise were highly controversial during the early years of the new millennium, said controversy never extended to the original Half-Life, despite being a violent game with highly political content. There are a lot of distinctions to be made between Half-Life and the more controversial Doom and GTA games, but happenstance is perhaps more important than it may seem. Half-Life just wasn't the game associated with real-world acts of violence. So in the early 21st century, there were two major motivations that game devs, specifically in the West and even more specifically American shooter franchises such as Half-Life, would have going into designing any sort of story, world, or new gameplay ideas and making a high-budget first-person shooter that would likely sell very well, avoid the Columbine stigma, and affirm the military-industrial complex. This meant that by 2004, we began seeing more and more games reach success by functioning, whether intentionally or not, as military propaganda, making the US military and government look noble in their efforts of stopping a vague, threatening other, characterized outside of gaming as terrorism, but rarely manifesting as terrorists in the game themselves, at least at the time. This shift towards militarism created a positive spin on the idea of young white men playing shooter games, that they were learning skills that would come in handy for stopping terrorism. Whether that was the explicit stated intentions of shooters at the time or just a happy accident, provided a nice spin away from associations with Columbine and in favor of the broader cultural trends at the time towards pro-military sentiment. This meant that by 2004, a game such as Half-Life 1, which allows you to freely kill innocent civilians for your own amusement with little direct consequence, and which involves you killing US military soldiers who are portrayed as inhumane and sadistic, would not be viewed as especially politically correct. Simply put, the world that made Half-Life 1 wasn't the same world in which Half-Life 2 would see release. So if they desired to make a successful sequel, Half-Life 2 would have to be different, or else be marketable to almost nobody. Half-Life 2 had much heavier shoes to fill than even the hype of the original game would lead one to believe. We were all a bit more naive at the time, and I was still very young when Half-Life 2 came out, but it's apparent to me only now, as a much more socially conscious adult, how much risk Half-Life 2 had going in, and how little reward it seemed could be gained from it. Half-Life 2 is one of the greatest sequels of all time for a reason, which is that whether it meant to be or not, it was in many ways a response to the cultural shifts that occurred after Half-Life 1, but not in the way one might think. Rather than acclimating to the new culture of games that emphasized placing trust in the US military and government, Half-Life 2 went, for lack of a better phrase, full Antifa. Half-Life 2 is, in essence, a game about the rise of fascism and the military-industrial complex that creates an unending machine of oppression, destruction, and death, and how the endgame political project of contemporary US and global society is the destruction of our planet for the betterment of an elite few who seek endless power at the expense of everyone and everything. It is basically a game about how neoliberalism is fascism, or at least necessarily will evolve into a form of fascism. And this fascism is expressed in our contemporary society via something called the Panopticon, a surveillance state in which everyone is simultaneously an oppressed person under the fascist machine and are ourselves agents of the machine, helping to maintain the fascist state in our lives through our hand in surveillance. It's a world where everyone watches everyone, and where no one is free, because we're not only all prisoners, but all prison guards as well. And with that, let's begin. To understand this video, we have to go over some academic concepts. I'll try to keep this short and simple. The concepts that inform this video are Foucault's concepts of governmentality and panopticism, Deleuze's concept of societies of control, and something we'll call the Omniopticon. Foucault argues in his book Discipline and Punish that the philosophy of government and law changed over the course of the modern era away from public spectacles of execution and towards a correctional system of prisons that viewed violence as a fundamental, if sometimes necessary, evil. This is governmentality, at its most literal level, the mentality of government, but it's better conceptualized as the way in which we organize our society and its various systems and infrastructures around an overarching philosophy of law and morality. Foucault argued that in the disciplined societies that sprouted from modernity and industrialization, the prison system in which people have their freedoms restricted in order to produce a corrected citizen that follows the values and ambitions of power groups, is a system we see manifest as the organizing principle of most institutions in Western society. In other words, prison, the military, school, and work are all organized according to the same ideas of correctional efforts as that of prison. This is a vast oversimplification of Foucault's arguments, but Foucault looks at one particular example of disciplined societies when he looks at the Panopticon. A Panopticon, first conceptualized in the 1700s as a more efficient prison design, is a prison in which all prisoners are positioned around a central point, typically a watchtower, from which a single guard can monitor all prisoners with ease at a moment's notice. The Panopticon design meant that less guards would be needed, and that with a single guard monitoring a large number of prisoners, prisoners were discouraged from ever acting against the wishes of the prison, because they could at any time be caught in the act of disobedience or problematic behaviors, and swiftly be punished for it. This meant two things. First, it meant that because a guard could be watching them at any one time, but not necessarily at all times, prisoners would have to assume they were being watched at all times regardless, and never got a sense of when they could or could not disobey, meaning they were not only physical prisoners, but psychological prisoners also. Second, it meant that a guard need not even be in the tower for the psychological imprisonment to take effect. The simple physical structure of the Panopticon was enough to convey a power imbalance so intense that prisoners would never feel free to loosen up or disobey in any way. It meant that not only could the prison more efficiently assert power over prisoners, but prisoners could then also assert the prison's power over themselves. Panopticons were built, but would eventually be decommissioned as they were seen as too inhumane. But despite being literally psychological torture, Foucault argues that we've structured our world around the idea of the Panopticon. This is what panopticism refers to, a social order in which the few survey the many, creating a dynamic in which our basic lives are structured around our own psychological imprisonment, knowing at any time that the hand of the powers that be could strike us down, and so being coerced into acting on our best behaviors in all public institutions, school, work, corporations, etc. We are always being observed, be it by cameras or on-site managers or factory owners, or teachers, or parents, so we can never be free to disobey the social order as organized by those with power. Deleuze, in his essay Postscripts on the Societies of Control, extends this argument outlined by Foucault to argue that in the digital age, we've evolved from a society of discipline to a society of control. Control societies extend the modernist Panopticon design of the world into a postmodern form of the same thing. Now, it's not only our role in public institutions in which we are psychological prisoners, but our role in all aspects of life. Credit cards, social security cards, passcodes, bureaucratic paper trails, state IDs, these all mean that we are always being tracked, and thus there is always some means through which power groups have access to information which could incriminate us, and can control the degree of access that we have to anything in the public or even private sphere. This means that the Panopticon is no longer just a result of physical institutions, but is woven into the fabric of our lives such that we are always at the behest of power groups, always being watched. This is what marks the society of control that Deleuze discusses. The increasing deprivation of public and private rights for citizens as we become integrated into a neoliberal network of owner-consumer relations. We are perpetually manipulated by corporate and legal power through the monitoring of our everyday mundane decisions and our role as consumer, citizen, and employee. We are no longer simply being disciplined when we do wrong, but are now being controlled in our actions and behaviors, subtly through these forms of manipulation. Nathan Jurgensen extends these concepts to an evolved version of panopticism called omniopticism. If the panopticon is a state in which one can observe and monitor the actions of many, then a theoretical omniopticon is a state in which the many can observe, monitor, and regulate the actions of the many. This self-regulation manifests in such a way that we act simultaneously as prisoner and prison guard. This omniopticon has manifested during the digital age via the role of social media and mass media, allowing us the power to monitor and control the actions of others through shaming and reporting of wrongdoing, while also recognizing that we too are being monitored and controlled by others at all times. In other words, look up caught shoplifting on YouTube. You'll see hundreds of results of videos where someone took out their phone and started filming someone who got caught breaking the law. These videos aren't police or corporations filming them. It's everyday people. It's the working class. The working class self-monitors to protect corporate interest in this case. It's the many surveying the many. These concepts are what we need to know to understand Half-Life 2. The Panopticon is a prison in which a tower allows one guard to view many prisoners and monitor their actions. Panopticism is the ideology that extends the design of the Panopticon into the general infrastructures of our society, allowing power groups to survey everyday people en masse and discipline any wrongdoer at any time, creating a psychological prison effect where we always feel that we have no option of defiance because we are always being watched. Societies of control are societies that use bureaucracy and highly advanced digital technology to not only monitor the actions of everyday people, but to coerce certain behaviors out of them. And omniopticism extends the panopticon into a theoretical omniopticon state, suggesting a world in which we are all prisoners and prison guards, all seeking to uphold the same status quo through how we assert power over ourselves and one another, and all fearing to defy the status quo because of the omnipresent reality that anyone around us could report us to authorities. In all of these concepts, the running thread is this. Capitalism, in order to maintain its power, creates a surveillance state, resulting in what I like to call soft fascism, a state in which all of the tenets of fascism are functionally active in a society, but in which the society does not organize itself around one singular central hierarchy. In other words, the neoliberal world we belong to is an extension of ideals that have historically paved the way for real fascist groups, and in the early 21st century, we began to see the overlap become much more prominent with the increasing militarization of the police, the increased global and domestic power of surveillance as a function of the war on terror, and the increasingly xenophobic and violent rhetoric that has justified countless acts of war and violence both by the military and by everyday people who have taken on the role of authority via acts of domestic terrorism. Foucault, Deleuze, Baudrillard, and other late 20th century philosophers witnessed and in some ways predicted a world that would look a lot like Half-Life 2, and our own world looks more like Half-Life 2 than we realized at the time. Half-Life 2 wasn't ahead of its time, it was just an early look at what our world was becoming since 2001. Let's talk about it.
Welcome. Welcome to City 17. You have chosen, or been chosen, to relocate to one of our finest remaining urban centers. I thought so much of City 17 that I elected to establish my administration here, in the Citadel so thoughtfully provided by our benefactors.
In Half-Life 1, the setting was a character unto itself. The Black Mesa research facility felt so alive, so vivid and real. It was certainly high-tech and sci-fi in many respects, but whereas most sci-fi shooters around that time were content to model their settings on cyberpunk influences or the Space Marine aesthetics of the Alien franchise, Black Mesa was so noteworthy because it was set in the contemporary era, with some small semblance of realism. By today's standards, very little about Black Mesa is realistic, but it certainly is a good impression, albeit heightened and exaggerated, of what contemporary corporate culture looks like today. It was an optimistic look at what science and technology could look like in the 21st century, while also being a cautionary tale about the consequences of such advancement. And it was because they used a contemporary setting, but gave it a touch of speculative futurism and sci-fi camp that made Black Mesa feel so authentic. That, and also Half-Life's novel approach to storytelling, by having the player experience everything as if it was happening live as Gordon Freeman. Black Mesa is viewed primarily through what it looks like in stages of increasing chaos and destruction, but as players we get a feel for what this place was prior to what it has become. This is vital to understanding how Half-Life tells its story. We only know so much about the world of Half-Life prior to playing it, but as we explore, we piece together great little bits of info that clue us into the fact that Black Mesa Research Facility is massive, powerful, and not always ethical. The decision to abandon Black Mesa in Half-Life 2 is necessary in a lot of respects, but also contributed generally to the feeling that something about Half-Life 2 was very different. It seemed like a strange decision at the time, and when I first played Half-Life 2, the sharp contrast in setting, graphics, core antagonists, and gameplay left me thinking that this couldn't really be Half-Life 2 at all. In retrospect, that was a bit silly of me. Half-Life 2 may not look the way the original did, and it certainly is very different. But Half-Life 2 is, in many ways, actually a remake of Half-Life 1. It carries over a lot of the same ideas as Half-Life 1, but it does so in ways that are somewhat subtle and reach new thematic depths. Half-Life 2 opens with a brief train ride as it arrives in City 17. This opening is a direct nod to the tram ride in Half-Life 1, but whereas that ride was simply a commute to Gordon's job, it will become apparent that the trains in Half-Life 2 are a deliberate parallel to the Holocaust. There will be a number of parallels to the Holocaust and the rise of Nazi Germany in Half-Life 2, and it's important to discuss for understanding the game, although I try to be careful when talking about such heavy topics, to only discuss them in a manner and to a degree which is necessary for the sake of understanding what is being conveyed, in this case in Half-Life 2. As is well known by now, trains were used to deport Jewish people to ghettos and concentration camps. The parallels are intentional and help to convey what City 17 is. In many ways, City 17 is a ghetto that people have been relocated to after the assault on and destruction of other areas, rendering them largely uninhabitable. Most humans, by this point in the story of Half-Life 2, have been killed, and those still left have been relocated to City 17. It's not apparent in the game whether or not there are other cities. Is it that there are several cities functioning as ghettos with others labeled 1 through 16, or is City 17 all that's left of humanity? The name being a consequence of several previous attempts at cities that had to be destroyed or become uninhabitable. City 17 is not only the equivalent to a real-world ghetto or concentration camp within the story of Half-Life 2, but it's also the equivalent to the prison which forms the Panopticon. This is established the very moment Freeman steps off the train. A flying drone with the camera looks at you, proceeds to take a flash photo of you, and Gordon walks into the station to the sound and sight of Administrator Wallace Breen. It's apparent from the very start of the game that Gordon has entered into a new world, a world of police and surveillance, a society of control. He has entered the Panopticon, where he is always being watched. The fascist police state of City 17 is reminiscent of those of fascist governments of the 1940s, but in many ways it's also reminiscent of neoliberalism and the contemporary culture of a post-9/11 world. The Metro Police at once resemble real-world SS officers and Nazi military, but also US police, Border Patrol, and SWAT teams, and the presence of US military overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. The parallels between these differing images is in many ways very disturbing, but these parallels existed long before Half-Life 2, and Half-Life 2's passing similarities to real-world events ties them all together in a very disturbing way. Administrator Breen is the watchful eye. He is the guard within the tower, watching you, the prisoner. Breen is, in many ways, meant to resemble a dictator. But while it's easy to see how he might parallel fascist dictators such as Hitler or Mussolini, he's very distinct from them in at least one significant way. Breen is not a very aggressive personality. The hard arm of fascism of the early 20th century relied on images of domination and power, but Breen is instead a very submissive figure. His attitude is one of a sort of phony love and respect for his people. He speaks softly. He shrouds his statement in euphemism and tries to put positive spins on what is obviously a bleak circumstance. Breen is an incredible example of what the shift towards a society of control looks like. Rather than public displays of domination and power being the method through which morality and law are arbitrated, instead, the arm of the law carries with it a sense of shame, as though the controlling of the common people is a necessary evil for the sake of a greater good. This evokes, to me, less the fascist dictators of the 30s and 40s, and more the neoliberal austerity principle of Thatcher and Reagan. Reagan's outlook on the economy was that, for the sake of the greater good of the economy, the common people would simply have to suffer, that it was a necessary moral consequence of their participation in American society. Reagan's rhetoric was one of compassion for suffering that he himself was forcing onto the people. His policies were cruel and violent, but the violence was presented softly, not via rounding up and massacring marginalized groups, but through allowing them to suffer and treating it as a moral good. Neoliberalism and fascism are not the same, but they lead to a lot of the same outcomes and are born out of similar ideologies. Neoliberalism is in many ways an easy layup for the rise of fascism. One could say the same of capitalism on the whole, as such ideas were explored in Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove and John Carpenter's They Live. City 17 is a society of control, and Breen's presence, his form of soft fascism, exists to assert that control, to make it known that resistance is useless, so that people will accept the fate that has been manufactured for them under the lie that it is inevitable or impossible to prevent. I use the phrase soft fascism here because while City 17 is absolutely a fascist police state, it carries with it the neoliberal rhetorical viewpoint that we saw rise in the 70s and 80s. Half-Life 2 blurs the distinction between the two right from the very start, in a manner which draws parallels between where America was by 2004 with where Germany was during its rise to power in the 1930s. Within the first minutes of gameplay, the player is introduced to the Metro Police. While the Metro Police will only end up being the primary enemies of the first act of the game, their backstory does a lot to establish exactly what kind of state the world is in. The Metro Police are a volunteer police force, meaning that they are humans who have chosen to act as police in the brutalization of other humans. But volunteer isn't really a trustworthy concept in a world run by the Combine. Likely, many joined because it was the only way to protect themselves or their families from imminent death as part of an ongoing global genocide. The Metro Police embody the concept of omniopticism, where civilians become both prisoner and prison guard, and all seek to control one another through a permanent watchful eye that necessitates conformity to a fascist machine. In this case, the Metro Police are civilians becoming actual agents of violence for the state, literalizing the metaphor of the Omniopticon by functioning both as prison guard and as prisoner of the Combine. The opening of Half-Life 2 only gives us a little taste of how far the world has fallen under the control of the Combine, but it's apparent from very early on that the situation is bleak, far bleaker than what we would expect following the events of Half-Life 1, and especially when compared to the opening chapter of Half-Life 1. This bleakness takes a turn for the better when Gordon meets his first familiar face, Barney Calhoun. Barney's backstory is perhaps most interesting of anyone in the game. Barney was one of the security guards who worked at Black Mesa. We learned throughout the course of Half-Life 1 that Black Mesa was up to something shady, but security guards, much like the scientists also stranded in Black Mesa under ever-worsening conditions, were just there to do their job, likely even less aware of what violence and cruelty Black Mesa were capable of and contributing to. It would be very difficult to be a security guard, explicitly tasked with protecting Black Mesa equipment first and foremost, with civilians considered a secondary priority and security guards the last in priority, to then have to face the fact that you are part of the problem that eventually led to the Combine taking over. Barney was an agent for a corporation with ties to the state, and while he himself was a decent guy, he was working for powers above him who were engaging in highly unethical practices. In other words, he didn't know the damage his employers were causing and how little they valued the lives of innocent people. Seeing Barney is not only welcoming to returning players, but also shows players how far Barney has come since the events of the first game. From being a security guard working to maintain a status quo that he didn't stand to gain much from, to being a resistance member working inside as part of the Metro Police to help destroy the Combine from within. Barney went from being unwittingly the agent of a machine of violence and oppression to being a saboteur of the machine of violence and oppression, while at the same time offering the player insight into what this world entails, how brutal the new world of Half-Life 2 has become. A lot has changed since the events of Half-Life 1. We learned throughout the game that Xen were not invading Earth, but were instead fleeing the oncoming threat of the Combine. The Combine found Earth through the Resonance Cascade, and in just 7 hours, waged a war on Earth that left humanity at the brink of extinction. The remaining humans were then forced like cattle into ghettos, seemingly given numerical names, with City 17 being the primary city of these last days of human civilization, as the Combine extracts what resources they can from Earth before destroying everything else and moving on. In this new world, the oceans have been drained, with waters receded. A sterilization field makes it so that humans can no longer reproduce, and humans are regularly killed or sent to Combine facilities to be tortured or systematically experimented on, even being assimilated into the Combine hive mind. The creatures of Xen that survive the Resonance Cascade have become part of the ecosystem of what remains of the Earth. Headcrabs have been captured by the Combine and unleashed to various locations in shuttles shaped like missiles, allowing them to run rampant and destroy local villages such as the one seen in Ravenholm. This is a world where absolute domination and forced occupation of lands have led to a police state and surveillance state, in which at any moment the hammer could come swinging down, destroying everything that they have left. This world is one that has real-life parallels. The most obvious one is, again, Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s. The Nazis sought conquest and, through war, occupied various nations and subjected them to brutal conditions, most especially Poland. While the World War II parallels are most likely the inspiration for the world we see in Half-Life 2, there are other parallels of note. While unlikely an inspiration for Half-Life 2's narrative, the wars waged in the Middle East by America in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 revealed forms of brutality that America had been engaging in since the very early days of these wars, that show that America has, in many respects, carried out a similar extreme state of violence and subjugation in the Middle East. And this conflict in many ways stems from America's role in the Middle East during the Cold War. The decision to use an Eastern European city for the primary setting of the game also evokes the Soviet satellite nations, which, although I'm less informed about, to my knowledge were similarly totalitarian and brutal. And last, the role of the Combine on Earth has parallels to the deprivation of natural resources and the role of capitalism in extracting resources globally, which has led to an ongoing climate change disaster that had been well known by Half-Life 2's development. It's not the specifics of real-world parallels that matter. It's the fact that Half-Life 2 is presenting a world that is very nearly true to our actual world, albeit with a sci-fi touch. Half-Life 1 attempted a sci-fi touch on what our world currently looks like, and I would say the same is true of Half-Life 2. The differences between these two games and their respective settings show just how much the world had changed in the time between the two games, better than anything else. While Half-Life 1 gets a large part of its tonal and setting ideas from the B-movie camp of yesteryear, Half-Life 2 evokes the dystopian classics such as Brave New World, 1984, as well as newer works such as A Clockwork Orange, Soylent Green, and The Matrix. This is partly due to the fact that any dystopian fiction with an authoritarian state is likely to have a lot of similarities in how its world is constructed. But a big part of why dystopian fiction comes to exist is to comment on the cultural landscape that the author observes at the time. Dystopian fiction is, consequently, often disturbingly close to reality. Half-Life 2's decision to explore a dystopian police state near future is much for the same reason as most dystopian works. It felt like that was where we were heading. Be it because of the technological revolution getting out of hand, the expansion of military and governmental power at the expense of global and domestic citizens, or the rising surveillance state, Half-Life 2 is a setting that reflects its own era all too well. There are a number of details about the conditions that people have been reduced to that we see throughout the game, even very early on. Gordon enters into an apartment complex that's being raided by the Metro Police. The indication the player gets from this scene is that this is a regular occurrence for the people left in City 17. The apartment complex is barren, having very little people living in it, and very little essentials for them to live off of. There are beat up old mattresses lying on the ground, but that's about it. We also see that they have TVs that are constantly playing a feed from Breen's office. What we learn in this early section of the game is that these aren't really apartments, they're prison cells. They live in an open-air prison. We see it on their prison-like jumpsuits, we see it in the squalid conditions they live under, the depriving of resources, and the routine brutalization they receive from Metro Police. They are prisoners in a Panopticon. City 17 is itself a Panopticon, and they are left always being watched, both symbolically by the presence of Breen's broadcast, and literally by the presence of Metro Police that routinely beat and apprehend them. These disturbing conditions that people live under are ultimately just the tip of the iceberg of how bad things get for the people in this new world. We see a lot more as the game progresses. Early in the game, in the Route Canal and Water Hazard chapters, we see an underground resistance network that aids Gordon in progressing to Black Mesa East on foot. While traversing the resistance network, we see what has become of those who do resist. They've been hidden in the deep confines of a decaying city. Gordon is having to survive by navigating through locations that are no more safe than anywhere he's seen yet. We see through this that even those places which exist outside of the Panopticon of a society of control offer little in space, security, or the necessities that allow freedom to be sustainable. The new world is one in which death, rot, destruction, and waste are the primary state of most things. The new world is a dying world. This is what things become when the common people suffocate under the weight of oppression from those with systematic power over them. They become like rats, hiding in sewers, attempting to be seen as little as possible, and finding nothing but darkness as they wait, never certain when the light might find them and take them away.
There he is!
Oh, all right, damn it, if that's what it takes. Just hurry, he's right behind me. Oh, shit.
In Half-Life 2, we see very little of the Combine themselves. We see, towards the very end of the game, a glimpse of the Combine advisors. These appear to be the origin point for the Combine, and we learn in expansions that they are capable of some great form of power, including apparent telekinesis and possible telepathy. The advisors, as we see in Half-Life 2, seem to be some kind of large slug or worm-like creature. I think it's interesting that, at the top level of the Combine, they're as faceless as anything else that is part of the Combine. As well, we never get a sense of their true motives or what lured them to want to destroy Earth or exploit its resources. But the Combine, despite having a hierarchical structure, is also a hive mind in which all individual motives seem to exist independently of the function of the hive in full. The Combine are a machine, being both a bureaucracy and an ideological or political faction. A recurring theme when discussing fascism is the banality of evil. Certainly, evil is made a lot more convenient in fiction by often portraying the motives of cruel or violent characters as having some deeper layer of sadism, misanthropy, or vengeance that becomes revealed at some point in the narrative. This simultaneously humanizes evil characters and also makes them more sympathetic, by virtue of portraying them as individuals expressing agency born out of desires that, on some level, we can relate to or at least comprehend. It's the lack of apparent motive that makes the Combine so disturbing. And sadly, this makes the Combine more real as an analog to political forces. In terms of what motivates political actions in the real world, there tend to be three major factors: cultural or ideological shifts, changes to material conditions, and the existence of the political system itself. And given that the first two factors aren't articulated in Half-Life 2, the narrative ambiguity serves to overemphasize the third factor, that the Combine is to some degree automated. It just exploits because exploitation is how it was built. It exists simply to harvest. This makes the Combine a more effective form of fascism than what we might expect of real-world fascist groups. Real-world fascism requires material conditions and cultural factors in order to gain power, but once it gains enough power, a system can be set up that doesn't require those to remain. In effect, the Combine is late-stage fascism. The Combine is highly bureaucratic in its design and aesthetic. And for me, the dystopia that the Combine most apparently resembles is Terry Gilliam's Brazil, where basic life is strictly regimented in such a way that breaking free becomes impossible. Brazil is one of the most bleak depictions of a dystopia for two reasons. First, it presents the least opportunities for hope of overcoming it, and second, because it's the dystopia that most easily resembles our daily life in a capitalist society. We see by the end of the game that the Combine sorts human bodies in much the way we might expect post offices to sort mail or file clerks to sort files. They're carried around in an assembly line manner, distributed to various locations via automation. This is where bureaucracy meets authoritarianism, where humans become little more than objects to sort for future use or disposal. We learn throughout Half-Life 2 and its expansions that some creatures become assimilated into the Combine. They have a vast army of incorporated humans as combined super soldiers, given cybernetic enhancements but deprived of all individuality and assimilated into the hive mind. Additionally, through the gunships, dropships, and striders, we can assume that they are either incorporating other intelligent creatures from other worlds into their hive mind, or are potentially creating synthetic life forms, though I'm guessing it's the former. The existence of these other creatures suggests that the Combine have done this before, that they've assimilated planets into them, leaving what remained of them desolate, and we have some reason to believe that this process involves some extreme forms of torture. The Stalkers, first introduced in Half-Life 2 but explored more in Episode 1, are the key example of how cruel the Combine is. They're former humans, having their minds wiped clean and their bodies repurposed to work in the Citadel. This seemed to involve forced amputations, forced starvation, and surgical procedures performed on their faces. The Stalkers are disturbing and the best evidence of Combine cruelty, but more importantly, the Stalkers show how the Combine are indifferent to the lived subjectivities of the people beneath them. The Stalkers were not created out of sadism, but out of an apparent efficiency. They were modified in order to make them more suitable to the tasks that the Combine want them to do. The dehumanization process and the assimilation process are one and the same. The Panopticon, after all, is not just a state in which people are always being watched. It's a system, a prison, from which there is not only no physical escape, but no psychological escape either. It's a form of psychological torture where the efficiency of the prison is a higher concern than the lived experience of the prisoners, where prisoners are just numbers, just marks on a piece of paper. It's a sort of top-down design philosophy, where the people conceptualizing the Panopticon have no interest in what effect it will have on prisoners, beyond whether or not it will make the prison run more efficiently and discourage disobedience more effectively. The ideology of efficiency helps to alter the material conditions that then produce the extreme cruelty we see. I'm not saying the Combine are not capable of sadism, but sadism isn't a motive behind their cruelty. If anything, sadism in the Combine is a byproduct of their cruelty. The physical and psychological torture is not an accident of their ambitions, it's just more effective to do so. This more sadistic streak within the Combine is best represented by the presence of the manhacks. Manhacks embody the concept of the Panopticon and Omniopticon rather well. Manhacks are easily my least favorite addition to Half-Life 2 from a gameplay standpoint, and yet despite hating encountering them, I feel like their addition is thematically necessary, and actually for the same reason why they're no fun to deal with. Manhacks are not interesting as a tactical option. They're slow, small, easy to destroy, and don't do nearly enough damage to kill anyone smart enough to resist them properly. Even just a simple baseball bat would be enough to handle them. And I think that's the point of manhacks. Manhacks don't exist for efficient violence. They exist for cruelty, to express dominance and to remind people that they are always being watched. The manhacks don't seem designed to kill people, but to torture them, partly physically, but mostly psychologically. Part of what makes manhacks so annoying from a gameplay perspective is how it seems like they could just show up at any time, just drop from on high into any setting to annoy our day. But that's what makes them a menace narratively. They exist to remind people that the Combine can, at any time, kill, maim, harm, torture, or perhaps most damning of all, watch humans. This aspect of violent surveillance is a core theme running through Half-Life 2. The manhacks aren't there because they're fun as a new enemy type. They're there because they reinforce how cruel, but also how vigilant the Combine truly is. They always have options at any time, anywhere, to rain down on their adversaries with great force and great power. The manhacks exist to remind humans that resistance is futile, that the machine consumes all. Because if the machine can find them anywhere, then there is no escape. They're on the conveyor belt. They're next.
Dr. Freeman, I presume.
I
better hurry.
The key to making Half-Life 2 feel like Half-Life 2 and not just some new game claiming to be a Half-Life sequel is in Half-Life 2's usage of familiar elements from the first game. The HEV suit carries over with its original sound effects. There's a number of direct callbacks to Black Mesa and the plot of the first game. Even very early on, we see a Vortigaunt, reminding us of what Half-Life 1 was. But most prominently, the usage of familiar characters who carry over from the first game, sometimes with their original voice actor, helps to remind us of the past world that Gordon once shared with them. Dr. Kleiner returns from Black Mesa with a model reminiscent of one of the default Half-Life 1 scientist models, and using the same voice actor who acted the majority of the scientists in the first game. Eli has a new voice actor, but is meant to be similar to another one of the default scientist models from the first game. And then there's of course Barney, who was the protagonist of the Half-Life 1 expansion Blue Shift, and who we saw throughout Half-Life 1, although at the time he was just a generic security guard model. Half-Life 2 takes great care to attempt to humanize its characters, in sharp contrast to the campy disaster tone of the first game. Each character is given some amount of depth, at least enough that they feel like people and not just like cardboard cutouts for Gordon to interact with. I would say that of the characters we see in Half-Life 2, Dr. Kleiner is the most interesting in seeing how much things have changed since the original game. Kleiner is clearly dedicated to science, with a can-do attitude that I think embodies the original spirit of what Black Mesa was about. The fact that he hasn't become disillusioned with his role of advancing human scientific endeavors after the disaster at Black Mesa, or especially after the takeover of the Earth by the Combine, is noteworthy. Instead, he clearly takes it upon himself to do what he can to help the Resistance. People need his brainpower to make resistance possible, and he is more than enthusiastic to meet the task. That sort of optimism and determination is something that makes Half-Life 2 feel less bleak and more hopeful. That same optimism and determination ends up being a fault for those around him, as demonstrated by his preoccupation with Lamar. Lamar is an interesting case because how you feel about Lamar will end up revealing a lot about where your mind is coming out of Half-Life 1 and into Half-Life 2. Do you share Kleiner's perspective that these deadly and sometimes disturbing creatures from the first game can ultimately be our friends? Or do you share Barney's perspective that it's a monster and should be treated as such? Neither perspective is invalidated by the game. Lamar is basically just a wild animal, the equivalent of a feral cat. Its instinct is to feed off of people's heads, but it's been rendered incapable of actually doing anything to people by virtue of having been de-beaked. If there's one thing Lamar tells us about the world of Half-Life 2, it's that it's not all cut and dry. Things are not simply enemies or friends, but can fit an ambiguous middle ground in various ways. We see this thought extended into the Vortigaunts, who gradually take more and more of a role in the Half-Life 2 expansions. But even in Half-Life 2's main campaign, we learn that Vortigaunts, who were formerly enslaved, have a complicated relationship to Gordon, who both helped to liberate them and slaughtered many of them in the first game. Vortigaunts are unambiguously allied to Gordon in Half-Life 2, but they don't view Gordon as a savior in the same way as humans do. Just as Half-Life began to display signs of the Black Mesa research facility as a morally ambiguous place, Half-Life 2 extends this to Gordon himself, showing that his role in Black Mesa is partly responsible for the suffering that we see throughout the game. Half-Life 2, then, is not just about Gordon's role of being the hero yet again, but a chance to right a broader wrong both in his own actions and in his role as a scientist at Black Mesa. This same reality extends to Dr. Kleiner and to Eli Vance, both of whom share in some of the guilt and responsibility in the Resonance Cascade and its consequences for life on Earth. When Gordon reaches Black Mesa East, Eli's hideout and newly constructed research facility, that's when the player first gets to see some insight into what happened between the events of Half-Life 1 and 2, where we learn about the 7-Hour War and Breen being declared the interim administrator, implying that his role is only temporary, and thus suggesting the impending full destruction of Earth and genocide of all life on it. While this bulletin board is clearly meant for the player to witness to efficiently clue people into what happened between the events of Half-Life 1 and 2, I think this bulletin board is more interesting from a character perspective. Presumably, Eli had some role in putting these newspaper clippings up. It feels to me like Eli's guilty conscience weighs on him, that he feels partly responsible for the takeover of the Combine, and places reminders of these events to not only acknowledge his role in what happened to the world, but also to remind himself of what he ought to be fighting against. Eli and Dr. Kleiner represent two opposing images of what people can go through when under such extreme circumstances as an ongoing genocide. Eli embodies both sorrow and anger, where he laments the role he played in allowing the Combine takeover to happen, but is motivated by his anger at Breen and the Combine to see them brought to justice. Kleiner, on the other hand, embodies the lighter side, being an eternal optimist and motivated by the joy of scientific pursuit. We see the contrast between the two characters based on what they display in their labs. Whereas Eli displays clippings of the takeover of the Combine, Kleiner displays an old picture of the Black Mesa science team, suggesting a good old days that he misses and longs for. For Kleiner, he's not naive about what the situation is, but he seems to be motivated in part by a desire to return to the simpler days of being a scientist, working on cutting-edge discoveries relating to outer space and teleportation. Kleiner misses the days when the glass is more full, and Eli dreads the possibility that the glass can become more empty. This is an oversimplification of their characters, but it's also worth noting that no character really gets extensive amount of time in the game to be fleshed out, and so the game uses environmental storytelling as a shorthand form of characterization. All of the characters express a variety of emotions, but are relatively flat as far as their role in this story. That is, except for one, Alex Vance. Alex is easily the most emphasized character in Half-Life 2 and its expansions, to the point where when Valve would eventually make another Half-Life game, it would be titled Half-Life Alyx and feature her as the player character. Alex is, of course, Eli's daughter, and given that the events of Half-Life 2 occur about 20 years after the events of the first Half-Life, this would mean that Alex is somewhere in her mid to late 20s, having been only a child during the events of the first Half-Life. This is important to her character, because Alex is by far the most lively and optimistic character of the bunch. She has lived most of her life under the rule of the Combine, and so her world has been shaped by the understanding of what this sort of situation entails. For a character like Eli, who lived most of his life prior to the Resonance Cascade and what followed, he can see the fall of a once okay world into brutality and hopelessness. But for Alex, she didn't see it through the same eyes. She certainly saw a lot of violence, cruelty, and change, but she saw it young enough that she has less to look back to contextualize the world in the same way. For Alex, the context is not, this could have been prevented, but this can be stopped, this can be changed. Alex is the first truly happy face we see in Half-Life 2, because this is her world as much as it is the Combine's. She's developed skill, resilience, and a psychological outlook to make this world her own. Alex reflects how younger generations come to grips with hardship in the world. Now, to look at it as an analog to our own world, we have to see it through at least two main lenses. First is my own lens as a person in my late 20s as of the writing of this video, putting myself around the same age as Alex. And if we look back 20 years, we see the events that marked the cultural change we saw between the two Half-Life games, 9/11 and the Iraq War. For people significantly older than myself, they lived in a world before 9/11, before Iraq, before the Patriot Act, and the increasingly politically tense and unethical circumstances we saw rise in the early 21st century. But for me, I spent most of my life after these changes. 9/11 is a very vague memory for me because I was only 7 years old when it happened. I knew the attacks on the World Trade Center were scary, but I didn't know what they were, what they meant. I especially didn't know the context of the conflicts in the Middle East and between the Middle East and Western colonizing nations that fueled the people responsible for carrying it out. So I grew up in a world where 9/11 and the ensuing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq just meant something else, where the growth of the contemporary surveillance state just meant something else to people older than myself. But I also grew up in a time where people were more naive about climate change, where the effects of climate change were poorly understood by the general public, and where we didn't really see its effects in our everyday lives, particularly in America and in more privileged communities in America. And that brings us to the second lens of how Alex's character reflects our own world. Younger generations, people in their early 20s and younger, will soon have lived more of their lives in the aftermath of a world continuously ravaged by the effects of climate change than before. The same could also be said of very young people growing up in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing and may not even be the last pandemic they will see in their lifetimes. For people who spent most of their lives prior to COVID might seem like a great fall from where we once were. The same could be said of people who lived most of their lives prior to the eye-opening effects of climate change that we began to see in the 2010s. The same could be said of people who lived most of their lives in the US prior to the rise of near-constant mass shootings. And the same could be said of people who lived most of their lives prior to 9/11 and the massive geopolitical changes that it influenced. Alex Vance in Half-Life 2 represents hope for the future despite the current global situation. This is part of why she becomes the most endearing character in the Half-Life franchise, but it's also why she plays such a prominent role in the narrative of Half-Life 2. It gives players a reason to keep playing, to think that Gordon could put a stop to this. But this is not expressed uniquely by Alex herself. It's expressed by all the major characters in the game that we see beyond the Combine and Breen. They all have not given up. They're all showing a willingness to fight the Combine, to fight for a greater good at all costs. One could then see Half-Life 2 as a very optimistic game because of how it challenges the reality of a bleak situation with the optimism of people as members of a still existing, yet seriously endangered society. But Half-Life 2 creates a delicate balance, tugging and pulling with the tone to show both sides of the coin. When Gordon arrives at Black Mesa East, he sees hope, but soon, He's about to have another encounter with despair.
What? Who is this? Another life to save? I'll keep my eye on you. More than that, I cannot promise.
Ravenholm functions really well as a visual metaphor for the overarching themes of Half-Life 2. Ravenholm was once a quaint but well-populated community that has become a wasteland, infested with headcrabs and zombified people. There's a term for when this kind of extreme destruction of a community happens. It's called a sacrifice zone. Corporate pollution or economic disinvestment can result often in local communities becoming ravaged by harsh conditions. If we were to extend this concept a little further, then the most obvious example of a sacrifice zone would be Pripyat, Ukraine, a town that was rendered uninhabitable due to the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown of 1986. Ravenholm demonstrates the exact toll that the Combine had on the Earth. Barren, diseased, and unlivable, Ravenholm is the first time that the player is forced to confront the impact of the Combine so directly, having seen indications of their power and oppressive nature, but never quite seeing what they did to humanity fully until now. During We Don't Go to Ravenholm, we meet what is, in my opinion, the best character in the Half-Life franchise, Father Grigori. There's a lot to be said about Father Grigori, even though we only encounter him for a very brief amount of actual gameplay. Judging by Grigori's name and accent, it's likely that he has lived in Ravenholm his whole life, or at least is from the region. We know that he's highly religious, some would say maybe even to the point of delusion or madness. There's definitely something off about Grigori. We don't know enough about him to say one way or the other. However, there are some details that I think are of note. First and foremost, the drip. I am not super well versed in the presentation of Christian authority figures in Eastern Europe, but despite being Father Grigori, he doesn't actually present as a religious authority. He has a cross necklace which he wears, but otherwise he seems to be wearing mostly casual denim clothes with red Converse. To me, what he wears is somewhat important in that it makes me think that Father Grigori is likely a self-appointed religious figure. In other words, he's not a real clergyman. He's a guy who took it upon himself to become one. And if you ask me, he likely became one in response to the destruction of Ravenholm by the Combine. One would be tempted to say this is because Father Grigori had gone mad, but I'd argue the opposite. My interpretation of Grigori is that he is fully sane, and that his strange demeanor isn't because he's an insane person in insane circumstances, but because he's a sane person in insane circumstances. Most people would likely leave a place like Ravenholm rather than continue living there long after it became uninhabitable. I imagine Grigori sees purpose in living there. I mean, think about it. If he did live in Ravenholm prior to the Combine invasion, then these zombies are his community. They're likely people he once knew. We learn throughout the game that whatever is happening to zombified people, they are experiencing extreme pain and anguish. They're not dead, so to speak, and when you talk to Grigori, you get the impression that he sees it as a religious ritual to kill these zombies. I interpret this as a mercy killing. He's trying to free his once human neighbors from the pain and torture of the bodily nightmare that is being a headcrab zombie. Grigori wants to help his neighbors by putting them out of their misery. To me, this expresses a theme of perseverance that runs throughout the game. Grigori, despite extremely bleak circumstances, did not give up hope or purpose. He found purpose in God and used that purpose to try what little he could to help his local community by ending their suffering. In this way, Grigori's story is both one of the most tragic of the Half-Life franchise and one of the most optimistic, because it shows how people find psychological and physical modes of resistance against their own violent subjugation. It's apparent when you meet Father Grigori that he's extremely smart, having rigged up several traps for killing various zombies and headcrabs, and also that he's very kind and uplifting. He's not deranged. His cheerful demeanor is certainly a tonal clash with his surroundings, but it's because he found peace despite being surrounded by despair. Ravenholm also introduces a new detail that I think isn't talked about enough in terms of implication. We learn that there are poison and fast headcrab variants and respective poison and fast zombies. When I played this game the first time around as a kid, I think I mostly noticed the change in gameplay, that they were new variants of an enemy type. But reflecting on it now, I notice more from a scientific perspective what it would mean for there to be poison and fast headcrabs. I think I might have for a while thought that these headcrabs existed in Zen, but we just didn't see them in the first game. As of late, I instead view the headcrab variants as having evolved from normal headcrabs. There's a moment in Ravenholm towards the end that I think is very interesting from a storytelling perspective. After being introduced to poison headcrab zombies and fast headcrab zombies, we see all 3 types of headcrabs in a mine shaft at the bottom, roaming around aimlessly like bugs. They are essentially all insects, resembling spiders most. Insects, bugs, arachnids, and creatures of their ilk tend to evolve much more rapidly than other species. This is because they live very shortly and reproduce in mass amounts. To sustain a species, they populate rapidly, and headcrabs seem to do the same. In this instance, I see this moment of staring down at all of these headcrabs as indicative of the fact that headcrabs are reproducing, repopulating, and thus evolving rapidly on Earth. And this rapid evolution into more dangerous and alien forms showcases how different the world has become since Gordon last saw it. This difference is one of decay, of rot, of parasitism. Headcrabs are wild animals. They don't think like the highly intelligent Combine advisors. They just exist, but their exploitation by the Combine was weaponized. And this weaponization of headcrabs shows how dangerous it is to offset the balance of nature. The Combine themselves are the parasites. They feed off of the Earth and its inhabitants at the latter's expense. Their impact is one which makes the world more strange, more sick, more barren, more hostile. This coincides with an alternate read of the evolution of the headcrabs. The other option is that the Combine bred headcrabs to evolve into their poison and fast headcrab varieties in order to further weaponize them. There is potentially some merit to this, as we see later in the game that the Combine launch rockets that hold fast headcrabs, though in my latest playthrough I didn't see any that launched poison headcrabs. Regardless, the effect of the Combine on the world is the rapid dispersal of disease, violence, and death. The headcrabs are simple creatures and are not assimilated into the Combine, seeing as they seem to be of fairly low intelligence. Instead, although parasitic by nature, they are being exploited by the Combine in such a way the Combine extends their parasitism to suit their own needs. Ravenholm is the consequence of this parasitism. Ravenholm is what is left of a world ravaged by fascism. In this case, its people were victims of biological warfare, a highly efficient but utterly inhumane method of political dominance and violence. But when fascism is in action, there is no ethical floor. In its place, just a bottomless pit. Highway 17 is the first time we're shown the effects of the Combine's decimation of the Earth on the planet's oceans. They seem to have drained a significant amount of water from the ocean. The waters have receded. When looking at it, it seems like it's receded maybe only about 100 feet from where it was before, but when you consider how much water would actually have to be removed for this to be possible, it's apparent how much the Combine has actually taken from the Earth. Somehow, this has given rise to antlions, which appear to be more wild creatures from elsewhere in the galaxy that have inhabited Earth and exist along the coastline, making travel along the coast on foot next to impossible. This, of course, is likely by design, as it disallows easy access to coastal travel and squeezes people further into City 17. Gordon uses a strange, seemingly slapped-together dune buggy to travel along this coast. When you see the presence of dozens of destroyed cars piled up along the highway of City 17, the implication is obvious that the Combine have destroyed all other modes of transportation that humanity could use to resist them. Deprivation is a key word. The Combine have deprived humanity of almost all resources possible through which to build strength, networks, resistance, or revolution. Travel by air, sea, and land has been destroyed, and it's through some combination of advanced scientific equipment supplied by former Black Mesa staff members and a bunch of scrap and junk lying around that humans have been able to cobble together to create new methods of resistance. It's interesting that the game goes to some length to avoid overemphasizing the old world. There isn't some old, pristine Chevy or heavily armored tank that someone hid away that somehow comes into play. And we know from the first game that the Half-Life universe has tanks, helicopters, etc. So the continued emphasis on cheaply made equipment is not just a piece of info that fills out the new world of Half-Life 2, but also sets an important theme for the game, the primary theme of the game's ludonarrative: how perseverance can overcome even the most extreme circumstances. In Highway 17, we pick up a special weapon, the crossbow. There was a crossbow in Half-Life 1, but while the crossbow's origins are a bit more ambiguous in the first game, the second game implies a path to its crossbow of note. It seems to have been designed by the Resistance, given its similar made-from-scrap design and it being discovered near the corpse of a resistance member. The crossbow, despite being a very useful and powerful weapon, is also notably archaic. People have been forced to go back to archaic methods of weapon design, suggesting the absence of resources necessary for things like bullets, shells, etc. The crossbow seems to use some kind of heated metal bar instead of arrows, further emphasizing the crudeness of resistance weaponry, and yet despite all of these details, the crossbow is one of the most powerful weapons in the game, able to kill an enemy with often only a single shot. The crossbow helps create a visual contrast between the highly technologically advanced weapons of the Combine, such as the pulse rifle, and the crude designs of weapons created by members of the Resistance, such as the crossbow. This contrast helps to further set a tone of how much humanity has the odds stacked against them. Conversely, the crossbow also shows that humanity will always have some means of resistance against oppressors, that there is always something that can be done to fight back. The crossbow is one of 3 types of weapons in the game from a narrative standpoint. It's a weapon that was developed after the arrival of the Combine by humans. Certainly crossbows existed before the Combine arrived on Earth, but the crossbow we actually see in the game looks fairly new. The only other weapon of this kind in the game, as far as I can tell, is the gravity gun. Then, there are the weapons that the Combine seem to have brought with them or developed for their own usage. Most Combine weapons are unusable by humans. The Strider, the gunships and dropships, and the strange fletchets that are fired by Combine technology all seem to be designed by the Combine or else appropriated from regions beyond Earth. The only weapon that we have that seems to be directly a Combine weapon through and through is the pulse rifle. But this opens up the third category, which are weapons that existed on Earth prior and seem to have been unaltered from their prior form. The 357 Magnum is the most obvious example of this, as it's a gun the Combine straight up just don't use. But the Combine does use SMGs and shotguns alongside the pulse rifle. It appears, though, that they didn't design these guns, as they use traditional bullets and shells and not more advanced technology. Thus, we see something happening with the weapon selection in this game. The Combine have integrated some of our earthly weapons into their arsenal. I imagine this is likely something that happens in real-world invasion scenarios. Rather than simply destroying all military equipment or weaponry, the invading military just appropriates those items which can be useful for their purposes and confiscates or destroys the rest. Furthermore, we see that the Combine have cars and helicopters that appear to be aesthetically coherent to Combine technology. It's unlikely that the Combine, prior to reaching Earth, had cars that were conveniently sized to transport humans or human-sized creatures. So what's more likely is that the Combine rapidly designed and mass-built vehicles for use by humans who have been recruited into the Combine. And we see this all over. The Combine have rapidly designed technology for the purposes of occupying Earth. They have reappropriated buildings which already existed, used guns which already existed, etc. This is part of the resource extraction concept. It's almost algorithmic. That which is most advantageous to incorporate becomes incorporated. That which is less valuable is systematically destroyed so that others can't use it. Highway 17 shows us a side of the world of Half-Life 2 that, although apparent much earlier on, starts to really become prominent beginning with Where You Don't Go to Ravenholm and becomes unavoidable here. That where there is freedom, there is nothing. The places where humans can be free on Earth have been destroyed to a point of being literally uninhabitable. While Ravenholm shows this perspective, Ravenholm also gives us Father Grigori. Highway 17, on the other hand, shows us pockets of camps where resistance groups have been staying, but they largely seem kind of stuck where they are, and are prone to invasion as soon as Gordon arrives. So Highway 17 shows us that, beyond the confines of City 17, there well and truly is nothing. And while we see by episode 2 that that's not 100% the case, it's enough the case that it would dissuade any person from trying to escape City 17. By depriving them of a world to escape to, escape becomes unnecessary or even pointless, and that's, of course, by design. This brings us back to the concept of the Panopticon. If you are always being watched, you are more likely to obey, and when there's nothing of value or hope beyond the watchful eye, one grows to view the watchful eye as the freedom itself. In other words, we're often conditioned to view submission as the closest thing to escape that we have. And though there are remote, technical chances of escaping into the recesses of what remains of our world in Half-Life 2, we become conditioned to see the brutality of the Panopticon as preferable to what may exist outside of it. This reflects on something somewhat bleak about our own world, that systematically we've been deprived of true freedom to such an extent that if we were to try to escape the modern world and find a true form of freedom to truly go off the grid and be outside of the confines of bureaucracy, surveillance, and the society of control more broadly, we would have so little in terms of resources or existential purpose that most people would likely just return back to the world they once rejected. I mean, without your job, your social world, your family, your gender, your race, your class, without these elements of society that are used to psychologically govern us, what are we? Well, we're not nothing, but our self-concept is so reliant on these institutions that we have a hard time seeing past them or seeing the worth in moving past them. Life without work becomes wasted life. Life without family becomes wasted life. And this is how the Panopticon operates. We all uphold certain societal values, which means we all uphold a certain social order. And because we believe in these values, we put pressure on others to believe the same. We become the watcher of those who fail in their tasks of family, of work, of law, of life, that we scrutinize their every decision, often subconsciously, and even if we don't all do this all the time, enough of us do it enough of the time that we always feel that we must perform these roles, and others feel the same way about their own roles in life. A world without the dependency of power and a society of control feels like a world of deprivation and emptiness, a wasteland of junk and garbage. And to me, Highway 17 embodies this idea as a space where there is nothing for us, thus making oppression a preferable alternative to freedom. As someone who appreciates having physical and psychological space to myself, where I can feel as though I'm completely alone, with no sense that anyone might happen upon me, I found the Ravenholm, and especially the Highway 17 parts of the game, to be the most peaceful parts of the playthrough. If it were up to me, I would have Valve make a whole game that plays like the Highway 17 chapter, but just for hours on end. I often retreat into video games to vicariously live out this feeling of vast vacancy, places where there's nothing but myself and significant space around me. I don't think peaceful was the exact tone that Valve was going for, but I do believe that Valve prioritizes a peaks and valleys approach to tension in their games, and Highway 17, despite having peaks and valleys within it, is definitely the part of the game that has the most low points of just existing in a space. I like when there's nothing, but most people I can imagine don't feel the same way. But games need that breathing room, otherwise they become overwhelming or exhausting to play. Half-Life 2 is specifically not exhausting to play precisely because there are moments where the game slows down and allows Gordon and the player time to ponder. It's in these places where I feel the story is best told. Not through climactic battles with heavy explosives and being endlessly pursued by a barrage of highly equipped foes, but instead via quiet time through which we can bear witness to an environment and to all that's happened to it. Highway 17 often gets quiet because everything that would have made noise is gone. No high tides, no vibrant sea life, no people nor their cars nor boats, just ghosts, memories of a time when things were different. When traversing Highway 17, we find a number of beach houses and similar shacks and small buildings that tell little stories in and of themselves. I feel as though each little story is worth the individual player discovering and trying to comprehend on their own terms. But the broader story told among them is one of former life. We see that these buildings have either become small Combine outposts or they've become ridden with headcrabs and often a small number of zombies. One could easily speculate that these homes were houses for the resistance that were inevitably crushed by Combine invasion. But I imagine these zombies to be former residents of these homes, that this was where they lived, same as the former residents of Ravenholm. Highway 17 reminds the player of a former peace. This once quiet, quaint seaside region has been ravaged, but has returned to the peace it once had, albeit in a sickened, deprived state. It creates a sense of despair, as though there is so little left to fight for. But what makes Highway 17 such a great piece of world building is in how much is said just through what the player experiences as they play. It's part environmental storytelling, but more environmental tone setting, creating a feeling that the player has to come to understand in their own way. When the game came out in 2004, I was still a kid. When I played Highway 17 for the first time, it felt, for lack of a better word, epic. It felt monumental, larger than life. It blew me away. But playing it as an adult, with the retrospect granted by the mass improvements in the technology and scope of AAA games, it feels so small. I think that both perspectives make sense to what is actually going on in Highway 17. Half-Life 2 is a game designed with the hopes of standing the test of time, much like Half-Life 1 before it. Both games show their age in some ways, but the way in which they best hold up is in how they use gameplay to tell a story. Highway 17's story is both monumental and quiet. It's both thrilling and dull. It contextualizes a now-dead environment with the active role that Gordon has in the narrative outside of it. Gordon isn't here to occupy Highway 17, but to traverse it. Each little story the player encounters is one that has already been told, one where the thrill is gone and only echoes remain. Gordon barrels through this area quickly enough that these stories don't stand out on a first playthrough, but take your time and actually bear witness to Highway 17, and you see that, like Ravenholm before it, something is very wrong. And the quiet despair of Highway 17 foreshadows what lies ahead. I think if I had to pick my personal favorite section of Half-Life 2, it would be the Russian in Nova Prospekt and the entire Nova Prospekt chapter. All Half-Life games intentionally strike a balance between moments of intensity and excitement, followed by more low-key atmospheric moments. This is done using a form of game design trickery, where the linear path that the player takes through the games is one that appears to naturally create these stark contrasts in tone. Designers have to think very deliberately about how they approach flow of gameplay, and while it would be easy to simply have the entire game be a never-ending sequence of intense set pieces like the Russian Nova Prospekt, that would become really exhausting. So there are convenient little paths that Gordon can enter into that open up new areas that feel less seen by the action at hand. I thought about this for a bit when playing through Water Hazard. When we find Black Mesa East, the fact that the Combine are immediately conducting an assault on Black Mesa East feels really natural as far as gameplay flow, but it almost makes no sense. We see Combine outposts all over the area, and we even see one literally just around the corner, almost within view of Black Mesa East. You would think if the Combine were hoping to locate such a place, literally right around the corner would be easy enough that they would have raided it a very long time ago. There is, of course, a justification players can make here, that the Combine only set up this nearest outpost very recently and had planned to raid Black Mesa East right up to the point when they did so in the game. It's certainly a little contrived, but it doesn't really matter when the takeaway is that the Combine inevitably does capture Black Mesa East. That said, the sudden shift in tone in We Don't Go to Ravenholm feels so abrasive compared to the rest of the game. It feels less like a progression and more like an aside, a whole separate story contained within itself. And I think this does a great job tonally of making Ravenholm an important piece of environmental storytelling. Ravenholm tells us something new about the world. It tells us something we didn't already know, about the effect the Combine and the Resonance Cascade have had on our world. The transition from Sand Traps to Nova Prospekt is a little similar to the sharp divide in pacing and thrill that we saw earlier in the game. But unlike Ravenholm, which proceeds to tell us something we didn't know, the Nova Prospekt section of the game tells us something we already did know. But what makes it such great storytelling is in how it paints a picture. Nova Prospekt appears to be a decommissioned prison. It's dilapidated and falling apart. It's hardly a humane place to reside. And while the Combine could easily set up a more high-tech facility for capture and interrogation as evidenced by the Citadel, they leave Nova Prospekt largely the same as it was before their arrival. In other words, humanity's prisons suffice for the cruelty the Combine wish to carry out. This is important, and it touches on a broader point I want to make about Half-Life 2. That, regardless of authorial intent or what the developers knew going into the making of the game, Half-Life 2 reflected a significant shift in the era of global politics in the time frame in which it came out. Abu Ghraib Prison was a prison open in Abu Ghraib, Iraq. Opened in the 1950s and closed in 2014, Abu Ghraib Prison found its moment of global fame in the early stages of the Iraq War, when it was found that American military and CIA personnel were using the prison to torture detainees in a number of ways, including physical, sexual, psychological, and religious torture. The conditions that prisoners were held in were severe and disturbing, and reflect the horrors of the American government and a military-industrial complex. This was an early indicator in the war that American forces were not the bastions of heroism and democracy that propaganda attempted to make us believe they were. Instead, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were in many ways a highly political and imperialist project, with motives that were not for the good of common people in our nation or abroad, but for the good of forces of political power in America. The Iraq War is a bit too big of a topic to condense into a video about a video game, but when I entered Nova Prospekt on my latest playthrough, I immediately thought back to highly publicized images of the Abu Ghraib prison and the conditions prisoners were subjected to. This sort of brutality of prison is not unique to that situation, and the conditions we see in Nova Prospekt parallel any number of prisons across the world. The point is, the legacy of human brutality against one another, against our own people and our own world, long predates any broader existential fears of outside forces of destruction. If we saw the Combine as a mass extinction event, it could easily be analogous to climate change or mutually assured destruction via nuclear fallout, both of which were anxieties that were already well formed by the time Half-Life 2 was in development. But the Combine is most obviously reflective of fascist and authoritarian regimes, colonialism, imperialism, etc. The domination of one group by another for the benefit of the dominating group is a tale as old as what we know of human civilization itself, but the Combine reflects the brutality seen in the modern era, beginning specifically in the 20th century with genocides carried out by dictatorships that were highly militarized and had more advanced technology of warfare and systematic violence than any era prior. Nova Prospekt is to me a piece of environmental storytelling in which the conditions we've subjected each other to as a species comes to be integrated seamlessly into the domination of the human species by another. The Combine don't always need to do much to edit our brutal man-made conditions, because we've already brutalized ourselves efficiently enough for their liking. The relative quietness to Nova Prospekt after entering it from the intense break-in sequence, to me, punctuates the reality of what's going on. It sets a dark tone as to humanity's past and what allowed us to get to this point. Something to note about systematic genocide is, well, it's systematic. Famously, when surviving Nazis were interrogated, they justified their actions by saying they were just doing their job. This is one of the bleak truths of genocide in our world, that by making the project of genocide a project that exists within a system, the individuals who carry out said project are at varying degrees of awareness, varying degrees of autonomy, varying degrees of directness in the act. Not everyone involved in the deaths of mass numbers of people are the ones carrying out murders. Some of them simply transport cargo that is used to do so. Some simply sign papers to make certain actions legal, or avert their eyes to criminal activities that are being carried out for the purposes of genocide. Some people simply report refugees to authorities, and sometimes are legally required to do so. And for those at the most direct side, those who carry out tortures, murders, etc., there's a number of factors within what we call the banality of evil. It's not just that you could be punished, imprisoned, or have harm done to you or your family, which is the more Hollywood version of why people engage in cruel acts. For those who actually carry out torture and murder, there's the combination of brainwashing, rewards given to those involved, and just generalized dehumanization of those being harmed. Racism and xenophobia play a large role. Looking, for example, at the Holocaust, no actions from any Nazi can be understood without in part understanding the rampant anti-Semitism that gave the Nazi Party their members and their popularity. They simply saw Jewish people as lesser people, and more often as subhuman altogether. This dehumanization was what made it not just easy to do, but for many a source of glee or pride. But that sort of hatefulness doesn't come from nowhere. It's not hardwired into people. It's programmed into people. And that programming comes from a combination of material conditions, cultural influence, and the general tendency in people to go along with the more popular or powerful position rather than resist it. The parallels are very intentional in Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 is in many ways a highly political game and a very grim game at that, and its grimness stems from the fact that it is so similar to how genocide is carried out historically. The Combine are literally programmed, literally brainwashed into a hive mind from which individual autonomy or motivation becomes secondary to the machine, and the machine consumes all. This is why they're called the Combine. It's a double meaning. First, there are combines, a harvesting vehicle that allows farmers to mass harvest crops. The Combine in Half-Life 2 is going around from place to place to harvest resources in mass. In the case of a combine, you either become swept up as a resource to be used by the farmer, or you're caught in its crossfire and destroyed, left as a piece of debris that didn't get used. Then there's the verb, combine, meaning to join together, to be grouped together, to merge. The Combine is not a specific species, but is instead an interstellar political faction that comprises several different species. In this sense, they all combine into one broader entity from which individuality doesn't really emerge. Once you join the Combine, you merge into it. You become it. It becomes you. This lack of autonomy, lack of individuality, or of individual mind or spirit or even body, means that those humans who become part of the Combine cease being human. In many regards, they can no longer be brought back to a human form, having been cybernetically enhanced and systematically brainwashed to such a degree that they no longer function as humans. They are simply a drone with a semi-human form. This is what the political project of genocide does to those in the oppressing end. It renders individual humanity secondary to the project. and thus dehumanizes the oppressor, albeit in a different manner to the oppressed. Of course, this is the broader existential threat that humanity imposes on itself, the complete objectification of people, robbed of their individual autonomy or ability to self-actualize. But the objectification of the oppressed and of the oppressor are both a result of the oppressor and the oppressive rule. In other words, genocide dehumanizes everyone by creating circumstances by which the system has more power than any individual inside it. Individuals within the Combine army are not humans because they have had their humanity robbed from them by the political project of the Combine. This is manifested literally in the narrative of the game, but similar truths manifest in existential and ideological dehumanization. When playing through Nova Prospekt, a thought occurred to me that I thought was worth discussing. The Combine are a little dumb. Thinking back to the AI in Half-Life 1, the foot soldiers are fairly difficult in combat because their AI was, for the time, way ahead of the curve, being able to throw grenades into your vicinity, retreat from attacks or when injured, and when contextualized with the usage of clear military chatter and commands, it creates the sense that they are coordinating together as a team. The Combine, on the other hand, seem a lot slower, more sluggish, and more willing to just run into a battle and die. At first, I thought this might just be worse AI, but I sort of think that it might be intentional. Hear me out. The project of the Combine on Earth is to extract all of its resources and effectively wipe out all remaining life on Earth otherwise, including wiping out humanity broadly. The Combine soldiers are incorporated former humans. If they die, then that's ultimately a win for the Combine because it means less humans. Humans are being pit against one another in this sense, for the benefit of the Combine as a broader political faction, headed by the advisors that to this point are still shrouded in a lot of mystery. The Combine doesn't really care about the survival of its soldiers. They can always just kidnap more people and create more soldiers. So the fact that the soldiers are a bit more sluggish and less intelligent than highly trained military individuals is a result of the general lack of concern for the well-being of the humans who once were and are now part of the Combine. The Combine are more for show in a sense. They are there because they are a threat to the average human, in part because they're highly militarized, but also in part because they have no mind of their own and no concern for if they live or die. They are simply pawns, but they are pawns that form a base that is extremely difficult for a resistance movement to penetrate. I think also that the chattering of the Combine is much less clear in its meaning compared to the soldiers of Half-Life 1, in part to further show that they no longer function as human. But what I find interesting is they still have human voices. It's just they don't speak in a discernible human language. They sound almost like an AI-generated version of words, where they resemble human modes of dialogue, but without any expected content of conversation. This helps to create the sense of alienation from their own humanity that we see throughout the game. We recognize them physically and audibly as human in some sense, but their humanity has further been robbed from them as they've become fully incorporated into the machine. In Nova Prospekt, we actually don't see much in the way of prisoners themselves. The cells are all empty, and what little we do see involves torture that, although grim, doesn't appear to be that different from torture being used in other places in City 17. It's evident when visiting Nova Prospekt that the quietness of the prison and the relative lack of goings-on inside suggests that there's a lot more that we don't see that's happening that justifies the intense amount of guarding that Gordon had to fight his way through to get there. Nova Prospekt appears to be a processing facility for prisoners who the Combine have apprehended elsewhere. Likely, it's a place where torture or assimilation is conducted. It's possible that Eli was going to be tortured, systematically experimented on, or even end up as a stalker or another piece of the Combine hive mind. It's also possible that Nova Prospekt is a death camp. There are 2 points of consideration. One is an argument Foucault made in Discipline and Punish about the nature of prisons in disciplinarian societies. Prisons are used not just to control or punish people, but to affirm a cultural shame that the society has around wrongdoing. Foucault argued that while in the past executions were a manner of public spectacle, being seen as the rightful arm of retribution for crimes against the king, this mode of thinking changed over the course of a few hundred years or so. The new mode of thinking was one in which punishment and violence against criminals was seen as a necessary evil, but an evil nonetheless. That the goal of punishment was not cruelty itself, but to correct immoral behaviors, to make the person right through the punishment. As such, prisons were constructed increasingly to make private the violence inflicted on the prisoner, to allow the public to easily ignore the violence perpetrated against prisoners, so that the violence would be seen as a shameful but necessary action against shamed people. We don't see what goes on in prisons most of the time. We have a very abstract notion of what a prison is. We just know that prisoners are taken away for doing evil or antisocial deeds, and through the process of prison, they are corrected and come out or don't, according to what is supposed to best serve the wants and needs of the broader society. This is, in many respects, a lie, but it's a lie that our society adopts as a truth. By making the realities of prison private, it creates a vague unease, but also a vague complacency in the violence perpetrated against prisoners and so-called wrongdoers. Nova Prospekt serves as an example of this in Half-Life 2. People leave to Nova Prospekt and they don't return. But the Combine seek to keep what actually goes on there a secret from the public, so that they won't become so outraged as to attempt to rise against them. The sharp tonal contrast between the prison break-in sequence and the actual early stages of Gordon's time in Nova Prospekt helps evoke the specter of shameful violence against prisoners. It reminds us of cruel and unjust conditions being both fully possible in our own world, but also hidden away behind closed doors, behind cracks and decaying walls. The other point of consideration is that this same shameful hiding away of violence against the wicked regime of thought was an instrumental part in the execution of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. At the time, Jews were simply hauled away somewhere where they wouldn't come back, and people both within Germany and outside of it were conditioned to view it as not significant. Certainly most people were aware that something was going on, but they were kept at enough of an emotional distance and with enough of a lack of knowledge that they didn't have to actually contend with it as a brutal act of genocide. People on some level knew that violence was happening, that people were being treated inhumanely, and that there was a systematic plan to do so, but it was kept private enough out of the line of sight of the general public, that the general public were able to ignore it long enough for it to become so systematically ingrained as to be unstoppable except by the force of multiple opposing countries in the Second World War. The unease one might feel when playing through Nova Prospekt is one that has damning real-world parallels, and those real-world parallels are not as far into our past as one might think. It's just we've been conditioned to ignore our own unease at what our own contemporary governments do in the name of justice. Nova Prospekt, if anything, is simply an echo of how humanity has treated one another, which gives us time to ponder if the world of Half-Life 2 is really all that different from our own, with or without the presence of the Combine. The structure of the Panopticon is a specific system. It's a system of watchfulness unified by one central point of surveillance. City 17 being a literal prison for the remaining people of the world of Half-Life 2, its center point, then, is the Citadel. Something very interesting happens when you first enter the Citadel. For the first time in the game, at least for me, it feels as though Gordon isn't being watched. The only way that Gordon finds his way into the Citadel, rather than with a triumphant breaking down of the door, is instead almost seemingly by accident. Dog finds a hole in the ground that Gordon can crawl through, and he gradually makes his way through the guts of the Citadel, a sort of backdoor entrance. The tone is set in the Citadel by these very opening moments. Whereas the Fall of Freeman chapter is easily the most bombastic, intense, and difficult chapter in the game, Gordon's arrival in the Citadel is easily one of its quietest moments. For a brief little while, there are no enemies, there is nothing to shoot at, nothing to do, except bear witness to whatever the Citadel is. This piece, this quiet coldness that marks our entrance into the Citadel, paints a picture that completes the theme that this video explores. The Citadel is the Watchtower. The Citadel is the center of the prison, from which the guards watch all of the prisoners. The Citadel is the key piece of the Panopticon. The reason why it feels as though you aren't being watched inside the Citadel is because the Citadel is where the watching happens. The Citadel functions as both a visual metaphor and a literal embodiment of the concept of the Watchtower within a Panopticon. With its massive size, it tells all citizens of City 17 that they are always being watched, always being observed, and thus are never free. This is made apparent by the fact that the Citadel is visible from almost anywhere in City 17. Its size is massive, and yet it feels at times somewhat hollow on the inside. Its size is, if anything, more psychological than pragmatic. It conveys the superiority of the Combine, their immense power and reach, and reminds humanity both of its lesser status and of the fact that they are always watching, and that we are always being watched. So when Gordon enters the Citadel, this is, perhaps for the first time since Ravenholm, a moment where we feel a sense of relief that we don't have to be engaged in a non-stop tug and pull of war against a massively powerful political group. It's the first time where things feel, in a sense, alright. And that calmness could be for many people disturbing or cause for caution. After all, we do see throughout the final act of the game that Gordon becomes entangled in a seemingly never-ending battle against Combine troops. Maybe the calm feeling that the Citadel evokes makes one think of the calm before the storm. But our benefactors and dark energy are, all things considered, a winding down compared to the previous few chapters of the game, which were marked by non-stop explosions and gunfire, massively destructive weapons, and the introduction of the Striders. In these last two chapters, all of Gordon's weapons are stripped from him, leaving him only with the gravity gun, that has somehow become supercharged by Combine technology. This hyper-powerful gravity gun results in a more low-key final act that, to me, resembles that of Zen from the first Half-Life. I believe I said this in my video about the original Half-Life that I did a long time ago. Zen is, in my opinion, one of the best moments in gaming history, despite its negative reception, because Zen is the moment where we meet something truly alien. Dropped into the Zen homeworld, we have to think differently, act differently, and fight differently in order to survive. Zen conveys the concept of a foreign land elsewhere in the universe very well by late 90s computer game standards. The Citadel mirrors this aspect of Zen. The sudden shift in gameplay, the sudden shift in tone, the shift in architectural design and aesthetic, the almost anticlimactic nature of it all. The Citadel is truly alien. But whereas Zen's feeling of hostility and indifference to the player was presented with naturalism, showing us the natural bodies of mass that Zen creatures occupy in some strange gravitational field, the Citadel's feeling of hostility and indifference stems from its machine-like nature. The Citadel, and the Combine on the whole, embodies the concept of the bureaucracy. It feels less naturalistic and more algorithmic. Its walls, bridges, and various technologies all have a soft yet cold blue hue to them. Its shapes are not Earth-like or seem human-inspired, but are instead jagged and geometrical, in ways that feel as though nobody was ever expected to simply live inside of it. No. Instead, the Citadel's interiors feel as if they exist primarily in a transitional state. To process prisoners, to integrate creatures into the Combine, to produce soldiers and send them on their way. The Citadel exists to sort and file, to mathematically arrange the various resources that exist on Earth, to extract only those which serve a greater function for the Combine, and discard the rest. This is not the most visceral image of genocide. In fact, if anything, it's the least visceral image of genocide, yet just as potent. So much of the act of systematically destroying a group of people, or in this case an entire planet, is the system itself, the series of executive decisions that give right to the power to destroy. The stamps of approval, the handshakes behind closed doors. So much of genocide is legislation and either generating legal forms of violence or finding legal loopholes to allow violence to occur. The Citadel embodies the cold, clinical element of genocide, one with pure detachment from the humanity of its victims and which seeks only to look at a phony notion of the objective numbers in question. And at the top of the Citadel, we see the one man who fills those shoes best. In the final chapter, Dark Energy, Gordon Freeman is taken to City 17 Administrator Wallace Breen's office. Despite the rest of the Citadel having the typical cold, metallic decor we come to expect from Combine technology, Breen's office is just ever so slightly more human. It looks to an extent like Breen might have attempted to recreate his office in Black Mesa. We learn during this scene that the game explicitly acknowledges the actions of the Combine as a genocide when Eli Vance describes what the Combine is doing as such.
What I've seen is also beyond words, Breen. Genocide. Indescribable evil. Good God.
Obviously, it objectively is a genocide, but it's worth noting just because genocide is a word loaded with political connotations, and Half-Life 2 is definitely intentionally going there throughout the game and in this moment. Breen doesn't view it the same way as Eli. He views his actions not as facilitating genocide, but as trying to cut the best deal he can with the Combine. It seems at this moment that Breen is not sadistic or cruel, but simply a bureaucrat trying to work from within the system. And this says a lot. Because ultimately, if you work as part of a system, particularly a system with power that engages in acts of mass violence, you share in the responsibilities of that system. You are part of the machine. And Breen is not just part of the machine, he's the face of the machine. He is the watchful eye that prevents humanity from feeling that they have any freedom and thus any methods of resistance. If the Citadel is the watchtower, Breen is the guard shining his light on City 17. And his cruelty may appear to him as simply doing his job and doing what's for the greater good, but there is no way of justifying genocide, even in its lesser stages or with lesser numbers. Breen demonstrates the banality of evil here. He is akin, in this circumstance, to the Nazi war criminals who argued that they were just doing their jobs. It ultimately doesn't matter why Breen does what he does, it's that he does it that matters. It's that he elects to place himself into the tower and suppress all manner of resistance under some phony notion of trying to protect humanity that makes him the ultimate villain of the core plot of Half-Life 2. One major rationale to justify acts of genocide is the notion of the savage or the uncivilized other. Historically, genocidal projects involved rhetoric that framed the perpetrators of genocide as the morally righteous and inevitable rulers of the victims of genocide. Specifically, there's a sort of paternal undercurrent, where indigenous groups and other groups that have been targeted by genocidal projects historically are viewed as childish and in need of being disciplined, of being made proper. This fuels racism by framing those targeted by racism as in need of being corrected for their inability to govern themselves properly by the standards of a white, racist society. This is, in many ways, at the heart of the concept of a society of control, at the heart of panopticism and omniopticism. Those in power see fit to watch those underneath them to correct them and make them behave properly. And we all assert this power over ourselves and one another as a consequence of our own morals being governed by fear of being the one in need of correcting. Breen's actions of trying to cut a deal with the Combine not only evoke the role of bureaucracy and genocide, but the role of capitalism. Capitalism as a system prioritizes an increase of wealth and power for those who have the most capital. Neoliberalism in particular focuses heavily on the role of economic deals to maintain its structure, where the best results for the wealthy are then viewed as the best results for society overall. Capitalism has a concerning relationship with fascism. The rise of the Nazis in Nazi Germany was, in part, due to the failure of the capitalist system that occurred during the Great Depression globally, but was exponentially worse in Germany, who paid greatly for their role in World War I. Hitler modeled the Holocaust on the Western expansion of the US and the consequential genocide of indigenous people throughout the time of the colonization of the Americas. Then there's the fact that capitalism as a system relied on the triangle trade slavery system, which killed millions of captive Africans, and which led directly to the taking off of the American colonial economy, which eventually would make capitalism the global force of power it is today. Capitalism cannot be divorced from genocide, and capitalism not only inspired a lot of elements of fascism, but also gave rise to it. This argument is not strictly my own, but has been explored in works of fiction, particularly dystopian science fiction. But the example that sticks out most overtly in my mind is Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, which ends with an explicit statement about the inevitability of capitalism evolving into fascism as a direct consequence of both the mistakes and the conscious choices of the elite. Breen's middleman approach to the Combine is akin to a capitalist's approach to a fascist or authoritarian system, to bargain rather than to dismantle, destroy, or resist. And because he chooses to bargain, he embodies the neoliberal spirit in regards to fascism, which ultimately exposes the neoliberal project as too close to fascism for there to be a meaningful distinction. Foucault's arguments of a society modeled on the physical and psychological imprisonment of most individuals was not an argument made of a hypothetical dictatorship. He was commenting specifically on the capitalist societies of the West that emerged during the era of industrialization. Panopticism is the idea that our capitalist societies are built to transform us into prisoners through the usage of labor and surveillance. The new Panopticon, then, is one which automates the process, such that the guard is wholly unnecessary and the prisoners will be governed nonetheless. Breen is for show. He exists to give the people the illusion that there is someone looking out for them, while also reminding them of the inevitability of their control at the hands of the Combine. If the Citadel embodies the Watchtower and Breen the guard who watches the prisoners, then the ending of Half-Life 2 shows us the end of such things. Breen dies, the Citadel is destroyed, and we know in this moment that the Combine no longer rules over humanity. So in this way, Half-Life 2 concludes the arc of panopticism and omniopticism that starts the game by its end. That's to be expected, but it's still satisfying to see. Eventually, the social control of oppression will collapse and people will be free. But doing so requires destroying the infrastructure, the very system that allows the Panopticon to function. This is an idea explored in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Destroying oppression is not the act of destroying the oppressor, but the act of destroying the oppressor-oppressed relationship, destroying the tools of oppression. destroying its system. And the Panopticon is a system of oppression that creates an oppressor-oppressed relationship. The tower, the prison cells, the guard, and the prisoners all form a dynamic that creates that system. To defeat the system, the prison cells and tower must be destroyed, the guard removed from a position of authority, and the prisoners granted freedom. This is exactly what happens in Half-Life 2. As we all know, the story didn't end there, and the Combine weren't done yet, but this is the signification of a broader victory that only just begins at the ending of Half-Life 2. The changing of the tide, the moment when humanity are no longer oppressed, but are now able to gain power back and change from resistance to revolution.
While its brethren remained in the blackest ocean abyss, with midless...
In a way, it doesn't get more bleak than the story of Half-Life 2, but by the end of the game, it's possible to make the opposite case. The Half-Life 2 is, if anything, a very optimistic story, especially by the standards of dystopian science fiction. Because the world of Half-Life 2 starts out exceptionally cruel and hopeless, and by the end, Gordon not only helps to create hope, but upsets the entire social and political order that produced the cruel, hopeless state we began in. And this is only over the course of a single week. Half-Life 2 shows one of the key sociological truths of revolution. The less people have to lose, the more inclined they will be to fight, and to fight with every last resource they have. What the people of City 17 lack in political or systematic power, they more than make up for in drive and determination. And this determination at its core is what Half-Life 2 is really about. If there's one way to characterize the plot of Half-Life 2, to view its themes through the lens of not just what we see in the game, but what we see change, this change is uniformly a change of freedom against oppressive and suppressive measures that have previously been laid out. We see this several times, even from the very early stages of the game. We find that the Vortigaunts, slaves in the previous game, are now free and seek to aid Gordon and humanity on Earth, coexisting seemingly as diaspora from the Resonance Cascade. But this continues throughout the game, this theme of freedom through resistance. We see in Ravenholm that Father Grigori attempts to set his congregation free spiritually by freeing them of the bodily torture of having become zombified by headcrabs. Grigori resists the oppressive state that the Combine has forced onto his world, and in this, he finds freedom. The Antlions, much like the Vortigaunts, are initially against Gordon and function as another way in which the Combine suppress resistance. But with the help of the Vortigaunts, Gordon is able to command the Antlions to aid in resistance. This is when it's apparent that the Antlions are not fundamental enemies of humanity. The two have just been pitted against one another through the manufactured circumstances that the Combine placed them under. And by reversing this, by taking control of the Antlions, Gordon is able to break into Nova Prospekt and seemingly destroy it from within. This is also the last time in the game we encounter Antlions, suggesting that what little arc they had in the narrative was one that emphasized freedom through resistance, the same as before. And then, just as the Antlions become part of Gordon's fight against the Combine, the citizens of City 17 begin taking up arms and doing the same. They find freedom through resistance. Where in the start of the game they would simply stand and wait to die, they now pick up weapons and fight to their last breath, even just for the remote chance that someone might do something to end the oppression that they've been forced to endure. It's interesting then that the ending of Half-Life 2 contradicts this overarching theme in the core narrative of the game. Just as we defeat Breen, destroy the Citadel, and potentially end the oppressive rule of the Combine, the G-Man wanders into frame to remind us that we've been under his control the entire time. But that's not really the end, is it? After all, there were 2 expansions to Half-Life 2 that continued the story immediately after this, and we see that the Vortigaunts prevent the G-Man from being able to take control of Gordon. Instead, episodes 1 and 2 show us the continuation of the themes from the main game. Gordon continually aids in the liberation of humanity as the Combine continues to desperately cling onto power while being rapidly destroyed by human efforts. Getting into the episodes in detail would take too long and is outside the scope of this video. Needless to say, the story is not complete at the end of Half-Life 2, and it's not really complete at the end of Episode 2 either, but when looking at Half-Life 2 as a cohesive text unto itself, and how it presents its themes and narrative, we see that Half-Life 2 presents themes that would only make sense to expand upon in Episodes 1 and 2. The Panopticon is much more prominent of a theme in Half-Life 2 because it's the earliest part of the story of the 3 games, beginning in the state where people are under permanent watch. But that watch can break, it just takes a movement. And this is something that Half-Life 2 forms a complicated relationship with. After all, the game shows, clearly, that Gordon is not a singular hero, but is more of a symbolic gesture of leadership behind which a movement forms. Gordon shows up not before a resistance movement forms, but after. The resistance has already set up an underground railroad system, has been plotting to take down the Combine, and has been coordinating up until the very moment when Gordon arrives, at which time Gordon simply aids those already in the resistance movement. Up until the Citadel, Gordon only takes one major step towards helping the revolution. By raiding Nova Prospekt and destroying it from within, this sparks humanity to go all in on the revolution that likely would have occurred otherwise. And this is often the case with acts of revolution. They're not spurred by one moment in isolation, but instead one or a few moments will tie into broader planning and coordinating behind the scenes that only goes mainstream in said moments. So then, the emphasis of Gordon Freeman as a heroic figure is, if anything, a vestige of an era of gaming that emphasized the individual role of the player as the most important, and sometimes, sole important role of heroism and narrative thrust. Gordon really is just some guy, but he's just some guy played by you, the player, and you're likely to be much more skilled at combat than the AI of the game, thus you make Gordon more than just some guy. I don't think it makes the game bad by any means that the game emphasizes how important Gordon is to everything, but I think that the games, in subtle ways, work to call into question the heroism narrative that surrounds Gordon. The game wants to have it both ways. Gordon is both a hero who saves the day largely by himself, and is also a puppet for a higher power with morally ambiguous motives. Is the G-Man the ultimate villain of the Half-Life franchise? The ultimate hero? Some secret third thing? Whether or not you feel the game succeeds at striking a balance between the moral ambiguity of Gordon's role as G-Man's pawn, or the moral righteousness of Gordon's role as savior of mankind, is up to you. I think that Half-Life 2 questions the narrative of heroism in a way that, if anything, should go to highlight all of the other people in the narrative who are just as important to the resistance movement. Alex, Barney, Dr. Klein, Eli, the Vortigaunts, and the many, many resistance members who fought and gave their lives to try to save what was left of the planet from the Combine's tyranny. In Half-Life 1, you were kind of just the hero because that's what games were. Half-Life 2 set out to be different. It set out to think about what it all means. And while Gordon's role at times can seem morally ambiguous, what matters as players is less about living out Gordon's heroic life story through gameplay, and more about what we observe of the world that Gordon has been dropped into. Gordon is a vessel for this much bigger story, a story much bigger than Gordon ever could be. He's just the centerpiece, the eyes that we see through which we can see everything that the world has become, and everything that the world could still be. Gordon is a prisoner the same as anyone else in the story. His being a prisoner of the G-Man, to me, serves a partly meta function. After all, the G-Man seems to exist outside of the confines of the logic of the world of Half-Life 2. He seems to exist more as a narrator than an entity within the game's world. He observes Gordon throughout the game, he brings Gordon into the story, and, at least by the end of this particular game in the franchise, he pulls Gordon out of the story once his role in it is finished, at least by G-Man standards. It would be easy to see the G-Man as an analog for the developers of the game, and I think there's some amount of merit to it. Just as developers manipulate the goings-on of a game, so too does G-Man manipulate the goings-on of Gordon's world. But while the meta angle could be worth examining in further detail, there's only really one detail that stands out to me as worth noting. That the G-Man is always watching, and seemingly always manipulating you. Most stories have some element of the real world that they want to make the audience aware of. Sometimes this is done bluntly, as in the case of a film like Inland Empire, but sometimes it's more subtle. Half-Life 2 kind of does both. The G-Man reminds us of our own government, what powers they possess beyond what we know. He reminds us of corporate power, of businessmen behind closed doors who determine the fates of many via the whims of a very few. The G-Man is here to remind us at the end of the game, not that Gordon isn't free, but that we aren't. That we still belong to a world to which many of the political truths explored in the game are just as true. The oppressive hand of bureaucracy, the systematic genocidal projects done in the name of the advancement of all but as a pretense simply to wipe out those seen as lesser, etc. And of course, there's the fact that we belong to a society of control. Like Foucault's Panopticon, we are always being watched. This is, to me, the ultimate takeaway of the ending of Half-Life 2, and why, unlike Portal, which patched in an alternate ending to retcon for the sake of sequels, the ending to Half-Life 2 is left standing despite being retconned in Half-Life 2 Episode 1 at the very start of that game. Because the ending isn't just literal, it's also poetic, and its metaphor reminds us that while the game is over, our lives are not. And while I would hardly say that Half-Life 2 is attempting to convince us to begin a revolution, the game shares the postmodern skepticism of a lot of media of its time, such as The Matrix and Fight Club, that turn the manipulation of propaganda towards the audience and demand us to think about ways in which we have been manipulated in our own lives, to our own detriment, and to the benefit of power groups. There's so much more that could be said, and while I would like to say that I'm building to some bigger concluding point that ties everything together, I think that what makes Half-Life 2's ending work so well is that it functions as a question mark. And while I could make a video exploring episodes 1 and 2 in more detail, I would have the same to say about the ending of episode 2, that it ends, again, with a question mark. I think a big part of why people have been so excited for so long about the possibility of Half-Life 3 is because they've built up in their heads that there is some grand resolution, either intended or even just possible, that would satisfy the discomfort that many of us feel with what is left of the story. Half-Life as a franchise is one in which people speculate endlessly on its lore and the implications. I tried to stray from that talk even though I enjoy thinking about it from time to time, for much the same reason I try to stray from talking about lore when talking about Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is not a finished work of art. It is not a statement with a sense of finality. It's a mystery, a series of questions that we have to ponder ourselves. The discomfort of the lack of an answer leads many to try to answer it, to try to create a unified theory of Twin Peaks. And I think that ultimately fails in even what it attempts, because if the intent of a work of art like Twin Peaks were finality, there would be finality. We would see all of these elements unify, which is why when Season 3 finally released 25 years later and didn't resolve the mysteries, didn't answer everything and wrap everything up neatly, there continued to be speculation for years after that Lynch had planned a Season 4 and that one day our answers would finally be delivered. I'm torn on the prospect of a Half-Life 3. If it ever does happen, I will gladly play it. But it's been so long now, and I've been with the Half-Life franchise for so long now, that I don't know if some convenient story finish would be satisfying. Half-Life 2's ending is tremendously unsatisfying, but for much the same reason that Season 2 of Twin Peaks ended on an unsatisfying note. It left us in a state of mystery and discomfort, trying to make sense of things. But while Half-Life 2 would immediately follow up on that discomfort, it did so in a very Twin Peaks-like way, sparking more mysteries, leaving more threads unanswered, and leaving us in its darkest moment. I haven't played Half-Life Alyx because I just can't afford the equipment and tech necessary to do so. But I know that if they ever do make a Half-Life 3, the only way to pull it off truly well would be to follow in the same path as Twin Peaks, and reflect on everything Half-Life has become as a legacy, without resolving the core contradictions and mysteries that lie within. Part of what makes Half-Life great is that it's a question mark of a franchise, one that gives us a lot to think about, but doesn't spoon-feed those thoughts to us. Certainly it does get a little direct and even sort of obnoxiously flattering to the player at times, but when at its best, Half-Life is a game that leaves open a little door of wonder, and that door can expand infinitely. And that's why, 2 decades later, Half-Life 2 still resonates so much with me. Because as a kid, I sought to have fun and experience all of the set pieces in their glory and be along for a thrill ride. But as an adult, the questions that the game left in me all these years have become more vivid and exact. It's not that the games have answers and I'm claiming to find them. It's that the game asked me a question, and all these years later, I feel like I found the answer that just made the most sense to me as I aged alongside the game. I'm writing this during extremely turbulent times, in which the phrase genocide has come up often. I don't want this video to seem inspired by current events. I actually had the idea for this video well over a year ago, and the initial inspiration for this video was just reading about neoliberalism and Foucault's concept of panopticism and governmentality, and beginning to see the analogs to the Combine. And that tells us, at the very least, that the truths that underscore this video are very, very old. They have to be, in order to be relevant during the time when Foucault was alive, through to the time in which Half-Life 2 was made, through to 2022 when I decided to make this video, through to now in 2024 when this video can finally see the light of day. These political truths are relevant only because they are never irrelevant. Oppression permeates the world to which we currently belong. It's sickening, and I don't feel like my grandiose deep dive on a 20-year-old video game does all that much to counteract the brutality currently going on in our world. But if it does anything, I hope it at least gives viewers something to think about in regards to how we experience our lives. Half-Life 2 is just a game, but its themes touch on truths that are much more serious than most games ever attempt to handle. In our real-world experience with themes of oppression, genocide, political suppression of dissidents, and the psychological self-governing that people do in order to accept the terms and conditions of control from above, is just something worth thinking about for longer than the length of one admittedly overly long YouTube video, not to mention longer than the length of one game. I really, really hope that people stay safe, cherish the good things in life, and take care of yourself always, and others as often as you can. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far into the video, thanks for watching, and also thanks to my patrons for supporting the creation of this video. This video took a long time to make, and I am very proud of how it came out. As far as future videos are concerned, I'm hoping to make a video about Dark Souls soon, that's similar to this, and also a video about Hotline Miami. My next big video essay project, though, is very likely going to be Lost Highway. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, and you haven't subscribed already by the end of this video, please subscribe. Please help support me on Patreon so I can make these kinds of videos, and have a great day. Thanks for watching.